Testing. Good morning. Welcome to. Good morning. There we go. Welcome to this morning's forum featuring Steve Paulson. I have some interesting facts to present about Steve before he begins. He was born in Rome, Italy, on Valentine's Day in 1960. And about a year and a half later, he and his family moved here to Milwaukee when his dad was hired as professor of political science and an administrator of the Peace Corps program at UWM. Steve was graduated from the Hartford Elementary School across from UWM, and 3 years later, graduated from Riverside High School. During a gap year, he completed an internship at the Smithsonian in DC, working with various animals. In 1980, Steve was graduated from Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, majoring in English literature. He completed his master's in journalism at UW-Madison. He did volunteer work for WORT, a community radio station in Madison. By 1984, he was working full-time for WHA Radio. For the last 30 years, Steve and his wife, Ann Strainchamps, have co-produced the NPR program To the Best of Our Knowledge, which has won a Peabody Award and which is broadcast a few times each week. He often serves as the host moderator of conferences sponsored by the New York Academy of Science and the Promega research firm in Madison. Steve and Ann have 2 grown children, Katie and Nick. Steve is known as a skeptic. Is that okay that I say that? Even for his parents' adventures to form an intentional eco-spiritual community called High Wind near Plymouth, Wisconsin. He is a recipient of the prestigious Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellowship in Science and Religion. His book, Atoms, A-T-O-M-S, and Eden, E-D-E-N, Conversations on Religion and Science, was published by the Oxford University Press in 2010. After his presentation, Steve looks forward to questions. Steve, we thank you for joining us this morning, and we welcome you.
Okay, you know what? Maybe, should I only use this?
No, you'll be better with that one. We'll just.
But I need to hold this up to there.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, maybe I should just go like this, and then when I'm ready to.
That may actually work best. Just
Okay.
flip that off. Maybe just clip this off, just in case it doesn't work. We'll just mute this for now.
I can't actually. Okay. Let's see, and I'm just gonna. Yeah.
That's the whole point, right?
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Bob could have said more about the introduction because he knows my parents very well, which is, I think, my circuitous path to being here through those connections. So let me plunge right on into this. For the last 15 years or so, as a journalist and as a radio producer, I've had a particular beat that has really fascinated me, and that is covering the relationship between science and spiritual experience, and a related subject, trying to understand the nature of consciousness, whether science can explain what's happening in our minds, or whether there are fundamental mysteries that science will never be able to explain. And I think this is a really important subject to explore because the dominant intellectual paradigm has been that science is the arbiter of what's real. I mean, if you read the New York Times, listen to NPR, talk to most academics, That's their framework for understanding the big existential questions. And personally, I think that's a problem because this paradigm has a tendency to reduce everything to materialist explanations about how the world works. So, to set the stage in my talk here, I want to go back to a book that Stephen Hawking wrote a few years before he died, where he said, we don't need God to explain the design of the universe. But actually, what's more interesting to me is his claim that science can finally answer some of the great existential questions, like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Hawking wrote, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead because it has not kept up with developments in science. Of course, Hawking was wrong. Philosophy is not dead, and religion isn't dead either, but what's really interesting is how the intellectual assault on philosophy and religion has come so far. And let me cite another example. Sam Harris, the famous atheist, came out with a book called The Moral Landscape, in which he argues that we need a new understanding of morality, but not based on religion, but on science. And he's out to demolish this idea that science is, by definition, a value-free space. So questions about meaning and purpose, the very things that philosophers and theologians have been obsessed about and arguing about for centuries, are now apparently in the realm of science. Now, I have to say, I love these books, and I love talking about them, and I love doing interviews about these kinds of big ideas, and that's what my own book, Atoms in Eden, was all about. It's a collection of 20 interviews with a lot of the major figures in the science and religion debate from all kinds of perspectives. So I talk with atheists and religious believers and people who I don't even know how to categorize. And if there's sort of an underlying agenda in my project, it's my belief that you have to approach these questions from all kinds of different perspectives. You know, you have to look at evolutionary biology and quantum physics and cosmology and neuroscience. And you also need a solid grounding in theology, religious history, and what William James called the varieties of religious experience. This is a very complicated and fascinating question. And there's a basic question that animates all of my interviews. What is a scientifically literate, rationally minded person, someone who is impatient with religious doctrine but open to spiritual experience? In other words, me. What is that person supposed to think about the fundamental mysteries of our place in the universe? So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is, because I'm a radio guy, I'm going to play a bunch of short audio clips from interviews I've done, and then it hopefully will lead to an interesting conversation with all of us. Now, I first came to this project about 15 years ago when I interviewed the renowned biologist E.O. Wilson, who grew up as a fundamentalist Southern Baptist in Alabama. He became one of the most outspoken critics of creationism. And in my interview, he argued strongly against the possibility of any kind of divine intervention in the evolutionary process. And then we got to this point in the interview. Let's see if this technology works of holding the mic right up to my laptop here.
I've heard you call yourself a deist.
Yeah, I don't want to be called an atheist.
Why not?
You know, being a good scientist and having been drawn up short so many times on my own theories, as all honest scientists are, I don't want to exclude the possibility of a creative force or deity. I think that would be a mistake. As Hans Kung, the theologian, once said, how are we to explain there is something and not nothing? Well, that's a question I'm happy to leave to the astrophysicist as to where the laws of the universe came and what is the meaning of the origin of existence. But I do feel confident there is no intervention of a deity in the origin of life and humanity.
So that's the distinction between theism and deism. And so
that is the distinction between. So I'm not a theist, but I'll be a provisional deist.
But no, so just so I understand this, to be a deist, you're saying that maybe there was some creator, some presence
Maybe,
that set in
maybe
motion
that has not
the
been
laws
discounted. That's not discounted yet as a hypothesis. So that's why I put the word provisional.
But it's fascinating because everything that you've said up till now suggests that you should be an atheist. Why sort of hold out that specter that, well, maybe there was some divine presence that got the whole thing going?
Well, because there's a possibility that a god or gods, I don't think it would resemble anything of the Judeo-Christian variety, or a super intelligent force came along, started the universe with a big bang, and then moved on to the next creation. I can't discount that.
So a lot of the conversation about science and religion really turns on how you understand a few key words like God, religion, transcendence. And a great deal also rides on how much of reality you think can be explained by science. One of my favorite interviews was with Karen Armstrong, a British historian who has written a number of best-selling books, including A History of God and a memoir, A Spiral Staircase, which charts her own spiritual journey from a young nun in a convent to atheist to how she now describes herself, a freelance monotheist. Don't ask. Her definition of religion is really interesting. She says none of the great religious prophets cared about big metaphysical systems or even theology.
Jesus did not spend a great deal of time discoursing about the Trinity or original sin or the incarnation or the atonement, which have preoccupied later Christians. He went around doing good, being compassionate. And in the Quran, metaphysical speculation is regarded as self-indulgent guesswork, zanna. And it makes people, the Quran says, quarrelsome and stupidly sectarian. You can't prove these things one way or the other, so why quarrel about it? And I think sometimes the way monotheists talk about God is unreligious.
And unreligious, like the personal God, for instance?
Yes, because people very often talk about him as though he's a kind of acquaintance and whom they can second guess. People will say, God loves that, God wills that, and God despises the other. And very often the opinions of the deity are made to coincide exactly with those of the speaker.
And yet we certainly see talk of a personal God in various sacred texts. I mean, the people aren't
Yes.
just making that up.
No, but the great theologians in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam say, yes, you begin with the idea of a God who is personal. But God transcends personality as God transcends every other human characteristic, such as gender. You know, very often people hear about God at about the same time as they're learning about Santa Claus. But their ideas of Santa Claus mature and change in time, but their idea of God remains infantile.
What about the supernatural, though? Do you need any sense
No.
of the miraculous or of things that cannot be explained by science, by this world?
I think religions hold us in an attitude of awe and wonder. People such as the Buddha thought miracles were rather vulgar, you know, displays of power that often displays of ego. If you look at the miracles attributed to Jesus, the healing miracles, they generally had some kind of symbolic aspect about healing the soul rather than showily showing off a supernatural power, you know, because that can be an exercise in egotism too.
Now, as you might guess, Richard Dawkins has a very different understanding of religion. He's, of course, an eminent biologist and the world's most famous atheist. And I have to say, Dawkins is a very fun person to interview because he does not mince words. So here's a short excerpt from our interview, which was somewhat contentious.
I think that religious belief is a scientific belief in the sense that it makes claims about the universe which are essentially scientific claims.
But what about the old adage that science deals with the how questions and religion deals with the why questions?
Yes, I think that's remarkably stupid, if I may say so. What on earth is a why question? There are why questions that mean something in a Darwinian world. We say, why do birds have wings? To fly with. They don't mean that, though. They mean why in a sort of deliberate, purposeful sense. Those of us who don't believe in religion, supernatural religion, would say there is no such thing as a why question in that sense. Now, the mere fact that you can frame an English sentence beginning with the word why does not mean that that English sentence deserves or should receive an answer. I could say, why are unicorns hollow? That's a perfectly good English sentence. It appears to mean something, but you don't think that it deserves an answer.
But it seems to me that the big why questions are, why are we here? And what is our purpose in life? Okay, that's a what question, but it's basically a why question. And
No, that's right. It is a why question, but it's
People
not
would
a question that deserves an answer.
Well, but I think most people would say those questions which are central to the way most people think about their lives. I mean, those are the big existential questions, but those are also questions that are beyond science.
If you mean what is the purpose of the existence of the universe, then I'm saying that that is quite simply begging the question. If you happen to be religious, you think that's a meaningful question. Those of us who don't believe in a God will say that is as illegitimate as the question, why are unicorns hollow? It just shouldn't be put. It's not a proper question to put. It doesn't deserve an answer.
I guess I don't understand that. I mean, doesn't every person wonder about that? I mean, isn't that just sort of this core question of what are we doing in this world? Doesn't everyone struggle with that?
There are core questions. There are core questions like, how did the universe begin? Where do the laws of physics come from? Where does life come from? Why, after some period of billions of years, did life originate on this planet and then start evolving? Those are all perfectly legitimate questions to which science can give answers. If not now, then we hope in the future. There may be some very, very deep questions, perhaps even where do the laws of physics come from, that science will never answer. That is perfectly possible. I'm hopeful, along with some physicists, that science will one day answer that question. But even if they don't, even if there are some supremely deep questions to which science can never answer, what on earth makes you think that religion can answer those questions?
I'm not saying that religion can answer, but I guess my point is that people still ask those questions, and as you've very articulately said, they seem to be beyond the purview of science, but aren't they still legitimate questions to ask about, even if you can't get any definitive answer?
Well, a legitimate question is, where do the laws of physics come from? An illegitimate question, in my view, is, what is the purpose of the laws of physics? Because what is the purpose of the laws of physics implies that there's some kind of deliberate purpose giver or purpose thinker, which begs the question we're trying to answer, which is there a God?
So that's Richard Dawkins. So I have to tell you, it is really hard to get a clear understanding of the words God and religion. So take the case of Albert Einstein. There is a huge debate between religious believers and atheists about who gets to claim Einstein, the most famous scientist of the last century. And it's because Einstein himself made a number of rather cryptic comments. He called himself a deeply religious non-believer. He said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And most famously, he claimed God does not play dice with the universe. So the question is, who is this God that Einstein was talking about? And I'm going to play you several different responses. And the first is from Elaine Pagels, the famous scholar of the Gnostic Gospels, whose late husband was the noted physicist Heinz Pagels.
You know, part of the problem there is that Einstein used the language about God as a conscious metaphor. When he said God doesn't play dice with the universe, that is, he meant the universe is not put together in an accidental way. Einstein was speaking about God in the way that physicists would, aware that language like that is always going to be metaphorical, speaking about something beyond our understanding.
The Nobel Prize-winning physicist and atheist Steven Weinberg had a very different take. He said Einstein was just using poetic language when he talked about religion, which from Weinberg's perspective was a big mistake.
Einstein, in a letter to a friend of his, famously explained that he did not believe in a God who cared about human beings, who was concerned with human affairs, that for him, God was a synonym for harmony and order in the universe. In other words, when Einstein says God, he really is talking about the laws of nature or whatever fundamental principle governs the universe. Clearly, what he meant by God is so vague and so far from conventional religion that it seems to me a misuse of the word. I think the concept of God has historically had a fairly definite meaning. Of course, people have argued endlessly about the attributes of God, but there were common features: that God was conscious, that God was powerful, that God was benevolent to some extent. If you're not going to use the word God to mean something like that, something like its historical meaning, then I don't think you should use the word.
So, for a very different view, let's turn to Einstein's recent biographer, Walter Isaacson. He says it's a mistake to dismiss Einstein's comments as strictly metaphorical. Isaacson claims that Einstein knew exactly what he was doing when he used words like God and religion.
At one point, some cardinal in Boston said, well, it still smacks of atheism because it's not a personal God. So Rabbi Goldstein, the head of the Reformed Jewish movement in New York, sends him a telegram and says, do you or do you not believe in God, Einstein? Answer 50 words or less. And Einstein says, I believe in Spinoza's God, a God whose spirit is manifest in the harmonies of the universe. I think the most important thing for Einstein is that there was a sense of humility. We do not know the answer here, but he did say he did have a belief in what he called his God, and a God as a creator.
Well, I think a lot of people just see this as, oh, he was exercising his poetic license. You know, he wanted to use God as kind of a synonym for mystery or something like that, but he took that word more seriously.
When he was asked whether he was using the word just symbolically or whatever, he said no, he wasn't. That he considered himself having a cosmic religion. He thought there was a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe, and to him that was his notion of God. Now, I know I've read Richard Dawkins, who says it's much more figurative. People kept saying, well, you're just speaking figuratively, and he says no.
There is, by the way, another really interesting piece of history. Many of the major figures in the development of 20th century physics, especially quantum physics, were fascinated by spiritual and philosophical ideas. Schrödinger had a profound Satori experience, and he was deeply influenced by Vedantic Hinduism. Heisenberg had similar experiences. Wolfgang Pauli was a patient of Carl Jung, and they carried on a correspondence for more than 30 years. In fact, Pauli became convinced that certain strange paranormal experiences were real. And there was the well-known Pauli effect. When he walked into the labs of other scientists, their equipment kept breaking, to the point where the other scientists told him to stay away. Apparently, this did not happen in his own laboratory. A little later, David Bohm, whom Einstein once considered his successor, had a very intense friendship with the Indian mystic Krishnamurti. These were all great scientists, but they were also philosophers who were humbled by the revelations of modern physics, and they thought the nature of material reality was profoundly mysterious, and my guess is they would find Stephen Hawking's statements about God and the death of philosophy to be very simplistic. So I want to come back to the question of language because it is so important to the public conversation about science and religion. There's a really fascinating movement among some secular scientists and philosophers to appropriate the word religion. While they don't believe in God, these, quote, religious naturalists are impatient with the hardcore atheists who simply dismiss religion. One of the most provocative arguments comes from the biologist Stuart Kauffman, who is one of the gurus of complexity theory and a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award. He doesn't just want to reclaim the word religion, he wants to change the meaning of the word God. Kauffman wrote a book called Reinventing the Sacred, but his notion of sacred is rooted in science. He talks about God as the ceaseless creativity in the universe, which he calls stunning, awesome, and worthy of reverence, and he rejects the scientific idea that everything can be reduced ultimately to the laws of physics. Kauffman believes that biology has its own unpredictable properties, and he says life, value, meaning, and consciousness are all things that emerge as part of this creative universe. But I still wasn't clear why he wanted to invent a whole new meaning for the word God.
God is the most powerful symbol humanity has created. We've been worshiping God or gods at least since the sacred Earth Mother 10,000 years ago in Europe. Whether it's the creator, transcendent God of the Abrahamic tradition or other notions of God, God carries with it a sense of awe, reverence, wonder that no other symbol carries. Now we have our choice. Is it more astonishing to believe that a creator God created everything that has come to exist, the planets, the galaxies, chemistry, life, consciousness, agency, in 6 days? Or is it equally or even more astonishing and awesome to believe what is almost certainly the truth, namely that all of this came to be all on its own?
Okay, you can say all that, but you don't have to talk about God. And yet you, for some reason, want to invoke.
I want to invoke God.
Yeah, why?
It is precisely to say that God is nature, or God is in nature. And that's the God of Spinoza. That's the God that Einstein believed in. If we can transfer our secular humanist, consumerist worldview into one in which we have this sense of responsibility, awe, and wonder for all life, we are inventing a global ethic that we don't have now, yet we need it to sustain the global civilization that's emerging.
Clearly, one of the big landmines in the science and religion debate is evolution. Various polls show that roughly half of all Americans believe that the Earth is no more than 10,000 years old, and 3/4 of Americans say the Bible is the Word of God. This may be partly a reaction to comments from certain atheists. For instance, the philosopher Daniel Dennett has talked about Darwinism as a kind of universal acid. It eats away at everything it touches, including, in his view, God as creator. Now, to me, the biggest intellectual challenge that the theory of evolution poses to religion has nothing to do with the story of Genesis and whether you read that literally. It's clear that you cannot reconcile a literal reading of the Bible with modern science. The real question is whether you can believe in both underlying purpose and natural selection, this very gradual process of random genetic mutations. Stephen Jay Gould believed that if you reran the tape of evolution, you would get a totally different result. You certainly would not end up with human beings again. This view has major theological implications. It raises the specter that humans are just a lucky evolutionary accident with no inherent meaning or purpose. So I don't think it's surprising that many religious believers find evolution to be very troubling. Now, in my mind, one of the most intriguing responses to Gould comes from the Cambridge University paleontologist Simon Conway Morris. His theory of convergence argues that the outcomes of evolution are highly constrained. There are only so many ways that creatures can evolve. And the most controversial part of his argument is his claim that the evolution of Homo sapiens, or intelligent creatures very much like us, was inevitable once life started on Earth.
Everything which makes us human is already present in a nascent form in one or other group of animals. This is not to say that every single species on the planet is trying to turn into humans. What I'm trying to say is that because of the striking convergences in the mental worlds, famously between crows and the great apes, but also dolphins, from that perspective, if we're first on the block, fine, but there are many other groups of animals which are really not so far behind.
But aren't human beings here by a massive stroke of luck? I mean, the asteroid.
Okay, here, we'll try this. Okay, let me back this up just a little bit here.
And the great apes, but also dolphins. From that perspective, if we're first on the block, fine, but there are many other groups of animals which are really not so far behind.
But aren't human beings here by a massive stroke of luck? I mean, the asteroid that hit the Earth 63 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs, and if that asteroid had never hit, wouldn't dinosaurs have continued to dominate the Earth and prevent large mammals from evolving, including humans?
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct. I think if the asteroid had sailed past harmlessly, and thank goodness nearly all asteroids do, then indeed the dinosaurs would be here at the present day. But what I want you to now imagine, in fact, is we've now got to fast forward our conversation by about 30 million years. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that the dinosaurs have now disappeared. They've been hunted to extinction, and we're still sitting in the studio, and we are using an advanced technology.
Who
I say
hunted the dinosaurs into extinction?
one or other group of warm-blooded creatures. It could have been the birds, sometimes underestimated, but more likely, I think, the mammals. So the asteroid hits, bang, okay, right, dinosaurs gone, big reptiles gone. Birds and mammals look at each other and say, well, this is a wonderful opportunity, let's evolve. But that asteroid misses. It's a counterfactual history. What's going to happen? Well, my view is, fortunately for us, but unfortunately for the dinosaurs, around about 20 million years after the asteroid missed, the world is actually beginning to get surprisingly cold. We're starting the great ice ages, which culminated in the last 3 or 4 million years. Now, in this counterfactual world, you've got the temperate and the polar regions, which are persistently cold. Now, we have good reason to think that dinosaurs are not effectively warm-blooded. We know that birds and mammals, by and large, are more intelligent than the reptiles. We know that they're more socially adept, and we know convergently that they evolve a proto-technology. They're tool makers. So then one says, what's going to happen next? Well, my sense would be that sooner or later, one or other group of hunters is going to emerge. It doesn't have to be exactly the same history as what we had on this planet, but the end result will be the same. What happened when the hunting really got going, especially in North America and to some extent Africa and also Australia, is all the big mammals disappeared. What would have happened in that counterfactual world would have been that it would have been a Tyrannosaurus going down under a hail of arrows and spears rather than the mastodon, for instance, in North America.
Okay, a little technical jujitsu here. So I should add that Simon Conway Morris is a Christian. He believes evolution has direction, but he's very cautious about saying that it has some purpose or endpoint. He says those are religious ideas rather than scientific concepts. Francis Collins is another prominent Christian scientist, and he may be uniquely situated to play a key role in this whole science and religion discussion. As the former head of both the Human Genome Project and the National Institutes for Health, he's one of America's most visible scientists, and he has impeccable scientific credentials, a medical degree, as well as a PhD in quantum mechanics, and he has a distinguished record as a gene hunter, and he's also an evangelical Christian, someone who has no qualms about professing his belief in miracles or seeing God's hand behind all of creation. In his book, The Language of God, he tries to stake out the middle ground between Darwinian atheists and religious fundamentalists. So I asked Francis Collins the same question that I asked Simon Conway Morris. Isn't it a lucky accident that the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, paving the way eventually for humans? And here is how he answered that question.
I don't think so. I can see the arguments that you just voiced and why they trouble people, but they are based upon the idea that God has the same limitations that we do. We are limited to the arrow of time. We cannot contemplate what it is like to be able to affect the future and the present and the past all at once. But God is not so limited. What appears random to us, such as an asteroid hitting the Earth, need not have been random to him at all. As soon as you accept the idea of God as creator, then the randomness argument essentially goes out the window.
Now, is this to say that God set that asteroid in motion that wiped out the dinosaurs so that eventually human beings could evolve?
Oh goodness, that's getting into more specific details than I would dare to imagine, but I would dare to say that God had a plan of creatures like us. Need they have looked exactly like us, or is in his image an indication of the spirit, the moral law, the free will, the sense of who we are, the consciousness, in which case perhaps it didn't matter so much whether that ended up occurring in mammals or some other life form.
Well, I guess I'm trying to figure out if you think that God intervenes in the affairs of human beings, because virtually all of your argument so far is no, God stays out of that realm of humanity.
I think God can intervene. I think that's what the great miracles are. Certainly God intervened in the person of Jesus Christ and in the most amazing miracle of all, of the resurrection. But I don't think God sort of pops up in lots of circumstances and turns around the course of events. I think those are reserved for special moments of special significance with a special lesson involved.
Well, I have to ask you about a couple of the best-known miracles in the Bible. Do you believe in the virgin birth?
I do.
And the resurrection? Do you believe that what was resurrected was the physical body of Jesus?
Physical body, we should be careful in terms of exactly what you mean by that. Does that mean the cellular structure was exactly the same as it was when he was alive? I don't know, but I believe that he was resurrected in physical form and seen by witnesses who he spoke to before he then ascended. That is the absolute cornerstone of the Christian faith.
But how can you, as a scientist, accept some of these ideas in the Bible because they cut so directly against the laws of nature?
I have no trouble at all because, again, the big decision is, do you believe in God? If you believe in God, and if God is more than nature, then there's no reason that God could not stage an invasion into the natural world, which to our limited perspective would appear to be a miracle.
One of the major points of contention in the whole science and religion debate is about consciousness, specifically the relationship between brain and mind. And the big question is whether the mind is strictly the product of the physical mechanics of the brain, the neurons and synaptic connections. And I actually think this, and not evolution, is now the cutting edge of the science and religion debate. So think about it. If you can communicate with God or some kind of cosmic intelligence, or if there really is life after death, then consciousness must go beyond the purely physical mechanics of the brain. So there are really two questions here. First, can consciousness originate outside the brain, with the brain acting as a kind of receiver, taking in consciousness rather than generating it? And second, will brain science ever be able to explain how the mind works? So I've asked a lot of people these questions, and here is an excerpt from my interview with the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who makes the argument from a materialist view of consciousness.
There's lots of puzzles, there aren't any mysteries. I don't think we have any truly mind-boggling perplexities. There's plenty of very hard problems out there, but I don't think consciousness is a mystery.
But there are all kinds of things that I can't imagine how science will ever be able to explain. For instance, the precise nature of how we love someone else. I mean, I'm not talking about the sex drive here, but I'm talking about the mystery of love, or why we have certain kinds of dreams. And dreams, of course, are not rooted at all in the physical world. I mean, if you dissect the brain somehow and look at all the neural connections, do you think science will ever be able to explain those things?
Sure. In what sense of explain? Let's build up to it, because science doesn't do this all in one fell swoop. There's modest inroads. Would you find it just unimaginable that science might, in the next 15 or 20 years, be able to read people's brains while they sleep and then write down what they're actually dreaming? Will you give me that kind of mind reading?
I don't think I would.
We can't do it yet. We can do it a little bit.
I don't give you that, actually.
Well, then hang on to your hat.
Okay.
That's coming. We can
You're saying science will be able to do that without any kind of self-reporting by the dreamer?
Oh, no, we'll use waking reports by dreamers, of course, to calibrate the instruments and understand how to decode the neural signals.
See, that's my point. That's my point. If you don't actually ask the person what they're dreaming, will you ever be able to decipher the dreams?
Well, let's build up to it then. So we ask the person what they're dreaming for 100 nights, and we build up a nice library, and we translate the relevant brain states for that person, and it will probably go person for person. I don't suppose it's going to be the same from one brain to the next. But then the idea that one might then be able to say a little bit later, oh, look, Jones is having that dream about the old car, and look, he's falling over a cliff now. And we wake him up, and that's what he reports. If you think that's just beyond the reach of science, I think you're wrong.
But that's just correlation. That's just,
That's right.
You're just looking at what so-and-so has dreamed, and you're just going to match the brain imaging to some future dream. That still doesn't explain how within the brain that particular kind of dream is generated.
Yeah, well, so then we have to do that too, but I think we're making good progress on that too. But we can't do that now. Might we do that in the future? Certainly.
Ken Wilber is a very different kind of philosopher. Unlike the reductionism of Dan Dennett, Wilber embraces what he calls an integral philosophy, a theory of consciousness with an explicitly spiritual dimension. He says a materialist understanding of consciousness simply doesn't get you anywhere.
If you're looking at just material stuff like a planet that doesn't have life on it or a rock, a physicist can tell you where that planet's going to be, barring other forces, 1,000 years from now. But that physicist cannot tell you where my dog's going to be 2 seconds from now. It reduces everything. I mean, if that's the case, then your statement itself and your awareness is nothing but neurochemical fireworks, and you can make no distinctions of value. There is no such thing as, love is better than hate. All those value distinctions are erased.
You can't make the value distinctions, but is there still anything to say that that scientific view is wrong?
Well, at this point, of course, you enter the philosophy of science, and the argument is endless. Is there nothing but physical stuff in the universe, or is there some sort of interiority? We're not talking about ghosts and goblins and souls and all that kind of stuff. Just, is there interiority? Is there an inside to the universe? And if there is interiority, as there is exteriority, then that interiority is where consciousness resides and where values reside. And you can't see that, but it's real.
So I've put the brain-mind question to dozens of people in my interviews. It's my little pet hobby horse that I like to try to figure out. And I've gotten lots of different answers. Even prominent atheists are all over the map on this question of consciousness. Unlike Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins told me, and I quote, "Consciousness is the biggest puzzle facing biology, neurobiology, computational studies, and evolutionary biology. It is a very, very big problem." Steven Pinker, the well-known cognitive psychologist, does not think science will ever figure out how the mind works by studying neurons and brain chemistry. To understand the mind, he says you have to look at higher levels of mental organization. And then there's Sam Harris, maybe the most vicious critic of religion of them all, but he is also a longtime Buddhist meditator who is quite open about his own spiritual experiences. And to my astonishment, he even told me about having telepathic experiences. Here's the very end of my first interview with Sam Harris.
You are a neuroscientist. Do you think there's any chance that human consciousness can survive after death?
I just don't know. One thing I can tell you is that we don't know what the actual relationship between consciousness and the physical world is. There are good reasons to be skeptical of the naive conception of a soul. We know that almost everything we take ourselves to be subjectively, all of our cognitive powers, our ability to understand language, this is mediated by the brain. And yet, we do not know what the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity ultimately is. And for instance, we could be living in a universe where consciousness goes all the way down to the bedrock, so that there is some interior subjective dimension to an electron, say. And we would not expect to see any evidence of this. And so I'm actually quite skeptical of our ever being able to resolve that question, what the real relationship between consciousness and matter ultimately is.
That's interesting, though, because most evolutionary biologists, I mean, particularly thinking the secular ones, would say, of course, consciousness cannot survive the brain. It will not survive death. You are not willing to make that claim.
Yeah, I just don't know. I'm just trying to be honest about my gradations of certainty. And I think consciousness poses a unique problem. And if we were living in a universe where consciousness survived death in some sense, or just transcended the brain so that single neurons were conscious, we would not expect to see it by our present techniques of neuroimaging or cellular neuroscience, and we would never expect to see it.
Now, I should say that even if you reject the materialist understanding of consciousness, you don't necessarily get to God. Sam Harris certainly does not think so. What it does mean is that you believe there are other dimensions of reality that contemporary science has a very hard time explaining, and it opens the door to various spiritual realities. Now, I have to say, I am particularly fascinated by mysticism, and this is partly what led me, surprisingly, to Jane Goodall, the famous field biologist. Her discoveries about chimpanzees revolutionized the field of primatology and really our understanding of what it means to be human. What is less well known is that Goodall also has a mystical side, and in fact even talks about having had a paranormal vision of her dead husband. On a personal note, I will add that Jane Goodall was my hero when I was growing up. In fact, when I finished high school, I spent, as Bob mentioned, 6 months interning at the National Zoo's research station in Front Royal, Virginia, because I wanted to do what Jane Goodall did. Didn't work out that way. Here I am in public radio, but I have the great privilege of interviewing people like Jane Goodall, and here is a portion of that interview.
Did you find yourself wondering what was happening inside the mind of a chimpanzee?
Constantly. I still maintain if I could be inside the mind of a chimpanzee for just a few minutes, I would learn more about them than another goodness knows how many years of study, because we can guess what they're thinking, but how do they think? How do they think? Are they thinking in pictures? How do you think without words? I spent ages thinking about that, wondering about it.
Were there any particular moments when you felt like you had a better understanding of that?
One moment was very, very special, and that was when I was sitting in the forest with David Greybeard, and I picked up a fruit and held it out to him, and he turned his head away, and I put my hand closer, and he turned, looking directly into my eyes. He reached out, took the fruit, dropped it. He really didn't want it. And then he very gently squeezed my hand, which is how chimpanzees reassure each other. And so in that moment, we communicated in a way that seems to predate words, perhaps in a way that was used by our own common ancestor millions of years ago. And it was an extraordinary feeling. It was bridging these two worlds.
Sounds like you're very drawn to this whole idea of somehow knowing the world without language, without words.
I am fascinated by it. I always have been. I mean, we think with words. And when we don't think with words, I think we come close to what mystics might describe as a mystical experience, because I don't think that words would come into that.
Did you have experiences like that at Gombe? I mean, what we would call mystical experiences?
Yeah, sometimes. One was just when I'd been following a little group of chimpanzees, and I was very wet, and they climbed in the evening up into this tree which had new shoots of beautiful lime green, and the sun behind them was making them shine, and the trunks of the trees were still wet, and the chimpanzees' coats were black ebony shot with little gleams of chestnut, and the smell of ripe figs was strong in the air. And then this beautiful male bushbuck appeared with his coat dark with the rain and his spiraled horns gleaming, and just stood there. And it seemed I could hear the insects really loud and clear. And it was just incredibly vivid beingness and being at one with that beautiful world.
Sounds like you lost your sense of your own self.
Well, that's it. Totally losing sense of one's own self. And that's the only way I can really study animals, because if I'm on my own, I forget that I'm there.
Now, I was going to end with that excerpt, but if you'll indulge me, I'm going to play one last clip, and this is from a second interview I did with Richard Dawkins when he came to Madison, because it pertains to a lot of the questions that we've been talking about how you define religion. And frankly, for a radio guy, Dawkins is just irresistible.
I came across a book that has just come out by Chris Hedges, the former New York Times reporter. The book is called I Don't Believe in Atheists. And I want to quote a passage from his book and get your reaction. He writes, The question is not whether God exists. It is whether we contemplate or are utterly indifferent to the transcendent, that which cannot be measured or quantified, that which lies beyond the reach of rational deduction. We all encounter this aspect of existence in love, beauty, alienation, loneliness, suffering, good, evil, and the reality of death. These powerful, non-rational, super-real forces in human life are the domain of religion. What do you make of that assessment of religion?
Bullshit. I mean, let's go through that. Was the word transcendent? Or I've forgotten the word.
Transcendent was one of his words, yes.
Okay. Now, in science, there are plenty of things that we don't know. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. Science is not a kind of know-it-all. We've got it all taped. There are going to be, in the next few hundred years, new scientific discoveries, new scientific insights, new scientific ideas, theories, which will be mind-boggling. So that's the first point. Now, he then went on to things like love and
alienation, suffering,
yeah.
reality of death.
Okay. Now, these are, of course, not immediately understandable by science in detail, just as when I look at a computer, I don't actually understand every detail of how it's doing what it is doing. However, that doesn't mean that anything mystical is going on. That passage you read to me is obscurantist rubbish, because it implies that that which is complicated and therefore hard to understand is therefore in principle impossible to understand, which means there's got to be something supernatural going on. Supernatural means nothing. It explains nothing. It's a cop-out.
So that is it. So anyway, I would love to talk with you if you have thoughts or questions or comments, or if any of this sparks any ideas. And Bob, how do you want to do that?
Let's maybe we'll swap out. So you
Okay, sure.
Now you're unmuted.
Okay, great.
Yes, you have talked to people who are, they're atheists. You've talked to people who have a strong sense of God, etc. Is there a common thread to both sides that you have found? And if there is a common thread, at what point do they begin to diverge in their understanding of that question of, is there a God?
Wow, that's a very good question. Well, I think there are lots of people who want to find common ground. I mean, among even the word believers is sort of a complicated word, but between those and people who would describe themselves, they don't believe in God, but they believe that we should all be able to get along together. There's no sort of, and usually what people try to do is they sort of try to wall off, sort of like religion or spiritual experience can deal with these things. Science deals with these. Stephen Jay Gould came up with this famous idea, what he called non-overlapping magisteria, where he said, science is in the realm of observable facts and things you can measure. Religion deals with values and morality. The problem is hardly anyone actually believes that you can draw that line there, because religion does make, and spiritual experience does make claims on reality, on the way the world works. And a lot of scientists also don't want to just give morality and values over to the other realms. So I think it's more a question of, do people in good conscience want to come together and to try to work things and come to agreeable disagreements? I think that's it. Whereas there are some people that are just either hardcore atheists who say, religion is evil, the root of many of our problems, or hardcore religious fundamentalists who don't want to hear any of the critiques. And so I think it's more a matter of attitude rather than a particular sort of intellectual line.
I was fascinated with all this conversation. And what struck me about halfway through this is that, oh my God, we are hearing the voices from one man after another. Where are the voices of all the women that have lived through this world and are only now beginning to be heard, and how wonderful it is to hear the voices of women being respected by men and women holding their own. And it's wonderful to see, but I wish we'd had more of it.
I agree with that. I mean, that's a very fair critique, and I will say that in terms of how sort of the science and religion debate has been framed, it's predominantly men who are the outspoken voices, and you know, maybe I'm partly at fault for showcasing these people. I mean, those are the people who have sort of framed it, but that is totally a valid point, and we absolutely need more perspectives from women. I think if I had sort of done a different kind of talk, focusing more on sort of from an experiential level, and I've certainly interviewed those people as well, women are more prominent in these discussions than sort of this strictly sort of at this theoretical level.
I have a question. The question is, when is the book available? Because part of this is retention, and you speak the transcripts and what you say is very important to somebody who's wondering. And like Hawkins, he's fantastic, and I've always admired his pronouncements in some ways. But I'd like to have you make a book.
Well, I actually, as Bob mentioned in his introduction, I did do a book which was a compilation of these interviews, which is called Adams and Eden: Conversations on Religion and Science. So actually a number of these interviews, transcripts of them are in that book. So that's what I have. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Question about prayer.
I'm sorry, about what?
Prayer.
Uh-huh.
So there is now scientific evidence that prayer works, that, you know, control group and such. I'm sure you're familiar with the impact of prayer on healing. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if you had any opinion about that. My second question is about, you mentioned in passing evolution non-directional. I'm a biologist, I've taught, and we teach that natural selection is indeed not directional. Adaptation happens due to environmental issues and survival of the ones that are fit. And I just wondered, you just said a little bit about that. I'd love to have you say a little bit more. So two totally different things.
Yeah. Certainly most biologists who I've talked to would say there's nothing directional about evolution. Although I will say, I mean, if you think about the field of astrobiology, so in other words, this question of is there life on other planets, elsewhere out in the universe, it is basically based on the idea that there are some common ways that biology has to evolve, that, you know, you start with carbon and oxygen and all of that, and then you will sort of build up. And so that's why, you know, basically the astrobiologists are looking, they wouldn't necessarily say, oh, you know, life on some distant planet is going to be like life on Earth, but there would be some similarities. I mean, that's the argument there, and that's sort of the argument that Simon Conway Morris is making, which is there are only so many ways that things can evolve. You know, you don't necessarily get to humans, but if you're going to make the argument for, you know, some intelligent life evolving on another planet, there are probably going to be some similarities between how it evolved on that planet, and unless the laws of biology and physics are totally different elsewhere, but there's no reason to think that. Now, on the question of prayer, yeah, that's a really, I think it's really hard to study. I mean, so one question is, I mean, it sort of would depend on, like, when you say does it work, and like how do you separate out the impact of prayer versus placebo, you know, that you believe it's going to work. And I mean, that's a whole other fascinating question, which is, I mean, the power of the placebo effect. I mean, don't diminish that. I mean, that's amazing that if we believe something is going to happen, it might happen. So I mean, scientists sort of want to dismiss that, but I think actually that's a really interesting phenomenon in itself. But I mean, you probably know more about the prayer studies than I do. So, I mean, what have you seen in some of those studies?
The studies all over the place, so I'm not an expert, except for personally, I have seen the impact of prayer. This is back to mystical, mysterious, divine intervention, but I've seen right in front of myself, miraculous cures. So it's back to, does God intervene in ways that we don't understand? And so mine is, I've noticed the studies, but because of my experience and seeing the impact of prayer and feeling it and watching it, I know.
Yeah, and let me just sort of say, not specifically about prayer, but I think there are all kinds of things that happen in our lives that are just beyond what science can explain. And it's like, do we even need studies that sort of try to show that prayer works? We have experience of that, and that's a whole other thing. And so, that's partly what I was trying to get at with some of these clips is like, we tend to defer to science to try to explain everything, because science is like, it's this really powerful paradigm that we have in the modern world. We really defer to science as, okay, this is what is telling us what's real, but in reality, there are lots of parts of our lives where, science really doesn't have that much to say about it. I think that's fine. I think we should sort of say, science can only go so far, but there's all this other stuff that's really important in our lives, like prayer. And yeah, why doesn't it work?
Yeah, I want to, first of all, thank you for coming today. I'm really glad you came and glad I got to hear your talk. You've got to have had one of the most fascinating careers of anybody I know. It's wonderful. You have called yourself, or Bob said you were a skeptic, and yet you have talked to many people who are among the most persuasive and compelling people there are. And I wanted to know who among all of the people you've interviewed has most challenged your skepticism, and who has been the most persuasive for you as a human being?
Let me modify that description of skeptic. I'm not a materialist, as in I think that you can sort of, look at the laws of physics or biology or whatever, and, that's going to explain everything. Actually, a lot of what I've been doing in the last decade or so has been sort of trying to reject that. So whether, I realize I'm talking in a church here, and, but I don't know what to do with sort of the word God or the idea of God. That doesn't particularly resonate for me in some way, but the idea that there's some larger consciousness that we can tap into, that's very meaningful to me. So I don't know, where do I fit in sort of like, does that make me a skeptic, not a skeptic? I don't know. So. Let me see, who are these people? I'm very taken by Karen Armstrong, the British historian who who is sort of trying to get away from sort of identifying belief with that religions. Actually, the person who I come back to over and over again is William James, who, if people are familiar with him, so he died about 100 years ago. He wrote this book. It's sort of really the founder of both American psychology, and he was a philosopher. His brother was Henry James, the famous novelist, and William James wrote this incredible book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is, it's a phenomenal book. It still holds up today. And his point in that book was that varieties, it's plural. There are all kinds of different ways people can have experiences. And he also had this phrase that he called himself a radical empiricist, which meant that he thought you should start with personal experience, and then you can sort of fit in your philosophy about how the world works around that. But start with the experience itself. And to me, that is very profound, that idea. And so I gravitate, so I'm obviously very interested in spiritual experience. I'm interested in mystical experience. And I think we have a hard time sort of trying to put those experiences in sort of theoretical boxes. It's very hard to explain those experiences.
In the news right now, there's so much about artificial intelligence. I'm wondering, and how rapidly it's advancing, and there's alarm that's been expressed by scientists. In your opinion, as it continues to advance, could a sense of consciousness emerge within the realm of artificial intelligence?
As you might imagine, I've asked a lot of people that question. I have my doubts. I mean, I think it's entirely possible, for instance, that machines could take over the world, but does that mean they have consciousness? I mean, consciousness is, I mean, so they could, machines are obviously extremely smart. I mean, the generative AI that we're starting to come up with now, but consciousness has more to do with some emotional aspect, some sort of feeling aspect, and maybe I don't really know. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I think machines can be incredibly powerful, but will they ever be conscious? I mean, I don't know that, I don't see any particular, could be. I mean, there's this famous neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, who is, he worked with Francis Crick on some of the early research on consciousness, sort of trying to come to the neural correlates of consciousness in the brain. And Koch will say that he thinks consciousness is all about the wiring. If you have enough sort of complicated wiring, it could be in the brain, it could be something else, then you could conceivably get consciousness. So it doesn't have to be organic material, it could be silicon. But I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really profound question. I don't know the answer, but I personally have doubts about that.
A big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. You've raised so many good questions.
I just have one other question. Yes. Do you recall in 1975, in the Milwaukee conference, athletic conference, who was undefeated in the gold division in tennis?
In the gold division, it might have been me. So my real claim to fame is I was the Milwaukee high school tennis champion.
That's your coach.
You still play?
I'm a total hacker, so yeah, I do play.
And this was your coach.